Imagine being invited to meet the most powerful monarch in 16th century Europe. Luxurious halls, exquisite delicacies, brilliant courtiers dressed in silk and velvet. Sounds tempting? Well, surviving there would be harder than in a modern maximum security prison. Henry VIII's court was a death machine disguised as a theater of grandeur. During his 38 years of rule, the king executed around 72,000 people more than died during the Great Plague of the 14th century in some English cities. Why we need to know this now? The history of the Tudor court isn't a museum exhibit, but an X-ray of human nature under absolute power. Every day you deal with hierarchies, unwritten rules, and the need to guess your boss's moods. The only difference is the stakes. Back then, a mistake cost you your head. Now, it costs you your career. But most importantly, Henry's court shows how quickly civilization turns into a jungle when one person gains power over life and death. In a world where democratic institutions are under threat and personality cults are being reborn in new forms, the lessons of Tudor England become prophetic. Breakfast with the king, a one-way ticket. You've woken up in Greenwich Palace. It's 1537, and you've been invited to the royal table. Seems like luck is smiling on you. Only courtiers know that breakfast with Henry could be your last meal. Court etiquette was like a minefield where every wrong step threatened an explosion. You can't sit until the king sits. You can't eat until he starts. You can't turn your back on him even when leaving. And most terrifying of all, you can't predict his mood. Thomas Cromwell, the king's closest advisor, once described a breakfast that turned into a nightmare. Henry was peacefully chatting with courtiers about the weather when someone carelessly mentioned Thomas More's name, the former chancellor, executed 2 years earlier. The king's face instantly darkened. "Traitors aren't worthy of mention at my table," he hissed through his teeth. Silence hung in the air. The courtiers froze, understanding that one of them might now be sent to the Tower. Fortunately, the king's attention switched to the musicians, but the lesson was learned at Henry's court. Even the dead could kill the living. Researcher David Starkey calculated that out of 100 people who regularly dined with the king in the 30s, 23 ended their lives on the executioner's block. The probability of death by the executioner's hand was higher for a courtier than for a soldier on the battlefield. But why did etiquette become so deadly? Henry turned every gesture into a political statement. A bow of insufficient depth meant disrespect for the king's divine authority. Too long a glance meant an attempt to read the royal thoughts. Not long enough meant neglecting his person. Modern psychologists call this paranoid narcissism, a condition where a person sees threat in every gesture and word. Henry lived in constant fear of conspiracies, and this fear turned his court into a psychological torture chamber. Courtiers developed a complex survival system. They studied the king's micro-expressions like ornithologists study the behavior of predatory birds. They learned to read his mood by his walk, by how he held his cup, by the intonation with which he said good morning. But even this didn't guarantee safety. Henry could wake up in excellent spirits and by noon send to execution someone he'd been laughing with over a witty joke that morning. Unpredictability was his weapon. No one dared to relax. Everyone lived in constant tension. Venetian ambassador Andrea Navigero wrote in a dispatch from 1531, "The English court resembles a theater where all actors play the role of happy courtiers. But behind the scenes, terror reigns. I've seen people faint from a single royal glance. When walls have ears and inform, having swallowed breakfast and miraculously avoided royal anger, you head for a walk through the palace galleries. Time to relax and chat with other courtiers? A mistake that could cost your life." In Henry VIII's world, paranoia wasn't a disease, but a survival condition. The king created an extensive spy network that turned every conversation into potential evidence against you. The court's informant system worked with the efficiency of modern intelligence services, but with the cruelty of medieval inquisition. Henry had at least 3 parallel intelligence structures: an official service under the Privy Council, a personal network of informants through royal chaplains, and an informal system of informants from among the courtiers. The most insidious thing was that the king encouraged informing but punished informants. A person who reported someone else's treason might receive a reward, but could become a victim at any moment after all. Who could vouch that he wasn't making up accusations for profit? Cromwell kept detailed records of all conversations that informants passed to him. Archives preserved amazing details. Who danced with whom at the ball, who looked too long at the portrait of the deposed Queen Catherine of Aragon, who sighed upon hearing the name of the executed Thomas More. Court ladies were particularly active spies. They had access to the Queen's chambers, could eavesdrop on conversations in the women's quarters, knew all romantic intrigues. Anne of Cleves, Henry's fourth wife, later told that her entourage included at least 3 women who regularly reported to the king about her every word. But the most terrible weapon was Henry's ability to turn friends into enemies with a single suspicion. Thomas More and Thomas Cromwell were close associates until the king decided that one of them posed a threat. He set them against each other, feeding each compromising information about the other. Modern research shows that in an atmosphere of total distrust, people lose the ability for sincere relationships. Henry's courtiers lived in chronic stress, which was reflected even in their appearance. Portraits from those years show prematurely aged people with tense faces. Spying technologies in the 16th century were primitive but effective. Letters were opened and read before being delivered to recipients. The palace walls had secret passages from which conversations could be overheard. Servants received extra pay for information about their masters. But most sophisticated of all, the king knew how to read people. He studied their weaknesses, fears, ambitions, then used this knowledge for manipulation. He knew that one feared for his family, another for his career, a third for his reputation. And he struck precisely at the pain points. The system worked so well that it suppressed even hints of conspiracies. But it had a flip side. The king gradually lost touch with reality. When everyone around you is either a spy or an object of surveillance, it's hard to understand what's really happening. Diseases of nobility, death in brocade clothes. By noon, you feel slightly unwell. Perhaps you ate something wrong at breakfast. In the 21st century, you'd take a pill and forget about it. In Henry VIII's world, any illness could become a death sentence not only for you, but for the doctors who couldn't cure you. Tudor-era medicine was a mixture of superstitions, alchemy, and primitive surgery. Doctors believed in the theory of 4 bodily humors and treated everything with bloodletting. Imagine, you have a high fever, and the doctor opens your veins to release excess hot blood. Henry himself suffered from numerous ailments, which made him an even more unpredictable tyrant. Modern doctors analyzed symptoms described in historical documents and concluded that the king suffered from type 2 diabetes, chronic leg ulcers, possibly syphilis, and episodes resembling bipolar disorder. His ulcers were so painful that their smell could be detected from several meters away. Courtiers learned to breathe through their mouths during audiences to avoid grimacing with disgust. Such a grimace could be interpreted as an insult to the king. Doctors tried hundreds of ways to treat the royal ailments. They applied crushed pearls, gold plates, and unicorn bones, actually narwhal tusks, to the ulcers. They fed him potions made from ground precious stones. The king swallowed mercury by the liter, which only worsened his condition and made him even more aggressive. But ordinary courtiers couldn't count on even such help. Epidemics regularly broke out in the palace. The English sweating sickness, a mysterious disease that could kill within hours, mowed down courtiers by the dozens. In 1538, the epidemic was so severe that Henry disbanded the court and hid in country castles. Those who fell ill were simply thrown outside the palace gates, let them die wherever they wanted, as long as they didn't infect others. Hygiene at court was horrifying despite the outward splendor. People washed once a month, considering frequent bathing harmful to health. They cleaned their teeth with rags, if they cleaned them at all. Wigs and elaborate clothing were infested with lice and fleas. Toilets consisted of wooden seats with holes, under which flowed a river of waste. The smell was so bad that court ladies carried small bottles of perfume and constantly sniffed them to avoid fainting. Childbirth was a death lottery. Of Henry's 6 wives, only 3 bore living children, and even then with major complications. Jane Seymour died of puerperal fever 12 days after giving birth to future King Edward. Midwives simply didn't know about the need to wash hands. Surgery was torture without anesthesia. Patients were tied to tables and given strong alcohol to dull the pain. Instruments weren't sterilized. Wounds were sewn with dirty thread. 1 in 5 operated patients survived. Most terrifying of all, any illness could be interpreted as divine punishment for sins or as a result of witchcraft. If a courtier fell ill at the wrong moment, he could be accused of simulation or of connections with the devil. Court physicians lived in constant fear. If their patient recovered, they received gold and honors. If he died, they might follow him to the next world. Royal physician William Butts was executed in 1540, allegedly for improper treatment, though in reality for his political views. Religious roulette, Catholic today, heretic tomorrow. By evening, you think of waiting out dangers in the chapel to pray, ask for God's protection. But in Henry VIII's world, even prayer could become a mortal sin. Everything depended on what faith the king professed that week. During his 38 years of rule, Henry changed religious beliefs 4 times. First, he was a devout Catholic who received the title Defender of the Faith from the Pope for fighting Lutheranism. Then he became Anglican, declaring himself head of the church. Then he leaned toward Protestantism, and in his final years returned to conservative positions. Each change, of course, meant new executions. Catholics were burned as heretics, Protestants as traitors. The most absurd case was the simultaneous execution in 1540. On one day, they burned 3 Protestants for denying transubstantiation and hanged 3 Catholics for denying royal supremacy in the church. Thomas More died for loyalty to the Pope. Thomas Cromwell for excessive zeal in destroying monasteries. Only 5 years passed between their executions, but religious winds had changed twice. Courtiers turned into chameleons of faith. In the morning, they prayed according to Catholic rite if the king was in the mood to remember traditions. In the evening, they sang Protestant psalms if rumors of new trends from Germany reached him. Some kept 2 sets of religious books at home and hid the inappropriate ones under floorboards. But worst of all was that Henry didn't just change faith, he demanded that subjects guess these changes in advance. Those who adapted too slowly became victims of old beliefs. Those who adapted too quickly were suspected of insincerity. Bishop Stephen Gardiner, one of the few churchmen who survived all religious zigzags, later wrote, "I learned to read the royal soul by his attitude toward the altar. If he knelt for a long time, expect a turn toward Catholicism. If he bowed hastily, prepare for Protestant innovations." Biblical erudition was most dangerous. Knowledge of Scripture could save, but could also kill depending on interpretation. Quote a verse supporting papal authority under an Anglican king, you'll go to the tower. Refer to the divine authority of the monarch under a king flirting with Protestantism, you'll get accusations of flattery and hypocrisy. The destruction of monasteries in the 30s became a gold rush for courtiers, but also a minefield for souls. Pious people saw sacred places turned into stables and church utensils melted down into decorations for royal mistresses. Many went mad from this cognitive dissonance. Court Lady Elizabeth Barton, called the Holy Maid of Kent, began prophesying against the royal divorce. Her visions attracted thousands of pilgrims, but ended with the noose for her. In 1534, she was executed for high treason. The king used religion as an instrument of political control. He understood that a person who changes faith by royal command is ready to betray anything. Religious compromises turned courtiers into hostages of their own conscience. Foreign diplomats were horrified by English religious anarchy. The French ambassador wrote, "In this country, each day can bring new doctrine. People are afraid to pray aloud because they don't know which prayer will become heresy tomorrow. Execution as entertainment, theater of death. The day is coming to an end, and you hope the worst is behind you." But courtiers are animatedly discussing tomorrow's performance at Tower Hill, the public execution of another traitor. In Henry's world, death wasn't tragedy, but spectacle. Public executions became the main entertainment of Tudor London. They drew more spectators than Shakespeare's theatrical productions and were discussed in taverns for weeks. The king turned death into political theater, where every detail carried symbolic meaning. The method of execution depended on the victim's status and the severity of the crime. Nobles were beheaded. This was considered mercy. Commoners were hanged, drawn, and quartered, often kept alive until the very end so they could feel the full measure of punishment. Women were burned. The church considered this more decent for the weaker sex. Anne Boleyn was granted special honor. She was executed with a French sword, not an axe. An executioner was specially brought from Calais because he was famous for his skill in quick and precise work. This was a manifestation of royal love. Henry wanted his second wife's death to be as painless as possible. But even merciful executions turned into nightmares. The Earl of Essex received a royal pardon. Right on the scaffold, the executioner had already raised his axe when a messenger arrived with a reprieve. The crowd rejoiced, considering it a miracle. But a week later, Essex was executed on a new charge. It turned out the first pardon was a performance to demonstrate royal magnanimity. Noble children grew up watching executions like carnivals. They were taken to see just retribution against traitors, explaining that this was how those who disobeyed the king were punished. 10-year-old Prince Edward coldly watched the execution of his uncle, Thomas Seymour, in 1549. The condemned themselves became part of the performance. They were expected to die worthily, confessing guilt, thanking the king for mercy, asking prayers for their sinful souls. Those who refused to play this role received additional torments. Thomas More delivered a speech before execution that became a classic of the genre. "I die the king's good servant, but God's first." These words sounded like a challenge, but were delivered in such a form that the king couldn't officially take offense. Executioners became celebrities. Master Gregory, chief executioner of the Tower, had apprentices who specialized in different types of execution. He received extra pay for clean work and tips from victims' families for quick completion of suffering. The crowd was part of the spectacle. It was supposed to be horrified and admiring, simultaneously horrified by the fate of traitors, admiring royal justice. Courtiers occupied the best seats, demonstrating loyalty by their presence at executions. But most ghoulish was that executions became a matter of fashion. Ladies wore their finest dresses, gentlemen their parade uniforms. Merchants sold sweets and ale like at a fair. Death became a social event, losing its sacred horror. Execution statistics under Henry astound the imagination. During his reign, more people were executed than in the previous 200 years of English history. This doesn't count those who died in prisons from torture and disease without waiting for trial. The king personally attended particularly important executions, watching from the Tower window. Witnesses recounted that he ate during executions, drank wine, sometimes commented on the proceedings. His subjects' deaths became routine spectacle for him, no more exciting than deer hunting. Intrigue and conspiracy, a game without rules. Night falls on the palace, but court life doesn't quiet down. It becomes even more dangerous. In the half-light of torches, conspiracies are woven, plans are built, intrigues are plotted. Welcome to a world where everyone is against everyone and no rules exist. Henry's court resembled a giant chessboard where pieces constantly changed color and purpose. Today's ally became tomorrow's enemy. Yesterday's enemy became savior. Only those who could play this deadly game better than others survived. There were three main factions at court. Conservatives led by the Duke of Norfolk, reformers under Thomas Cromwell's leadership, and the court party temporary alliances around royal favorites. Each group had its own agents, information sources, and plans to destroy opponents. The most skilled intriguer was Thomas Cromwell, a blacksmith's son who became the king's right hand. He could turn enemies into allies, and allies into weapons against new enemies. His fall in 1540 came as a result of a brilliantly planned conspiracy by the Duke of Norfolk, who managed to turn the king against his former protege. Women played a special role in these intrigues. They couldn't hold official positions, but had access to the king through the bedroom and could influence his decisions in moments of intimacy. Each new royal mistress changed the balance of power at court. Anne Boleyn came to power by destroying Cardinal Wolsey, the most powerful man in England after the king. She used her charms to turn Henry against the old minister, accusing him of secret negotiations with Rome. Wolsey died on the way to execution, unable to bear the disgrace. But Anne herself became a victim of intrigue when courtiers realized her influence over the king was weakening. All factions united against her: conservatives, who hated her for religious reforms, and moderates who feared her unpredictability. The accusations of adultery and incest were fabricated, but the king believed them, or pretended to believe. Conspiracies were woven even within the royal family. Princess Mary, Catherine of Aragon's daughter, spent long years in disgrace for refusing to acknowledge the legality of her parents' divorce. Supporters of the old faith gathered around her, dreaming of Catholic restoration. Princess Elizabeth, Anne Boleyn's daughter, was still a child, but had already become the center of Protestant party intrigues. Her tutors carefully prepared the future queen for the struggle for power, teaching not only Latin and Greek, but also the art of political survival. The most dangerous conspiracies arose from personal grievances. The Earl of Surrey, one of the finest poets of his time, was executed for including elements of royal symbolism in his coat of arms. This was interpreted as a claim to the throne, though Surrey was simply proud of his family's ancient lineage. Courtiers learned to read the slightest changes in royal behavior. If Henry greeted one of his favorites coldly, feverish attempts began to understand the reason for disfavor and distance themselves from the potential victim. But sometimes, this was a trap. The king deliberately showed displeasure to see which courtiers were ready to betray yesterday's friend. Information was the main weapon in this war. Whoever first learned of royal plans gained enormous advantage. Therefore, each faction tried to recruit agents among servants, secretaries, priests, anyone who had access to confidential information. The most sophisticated conspiracy was the case of Catherine Howard, the king's fifth wife. Her enemies managed to dig up compromising facts from her past and arrange the exposure so that the king himself became the initiator of the investigation. Catherine was executed, and with her perished dozens of people connected to her family. Debunking myths, truth behind the facade. Centuries of romanticization have distorted our perception of Henry VIII's court. Hollywood films and historical novels have created beautiful legends behind which cruel reality hides. It's time to dispel the main myths about merry old England. Myth 1. Luxurious life meant happy life. Indeed, courtiers wore silk and velvet, ate from golden plates, lived in luxurious chambers. But this luxury was a gilded cage. Every item of clothing, every ornament, every gesture was regulated by the strictest etiquette. Courtiers were beautiful marionettes in the hands of an unpredictable puppeteer. Modern analysis of court portraits shows that behind powdered faces and luxurious attire hid people in chronic stress. Premature gray hair, deep wrinkles, tense poses, physiological signs of constant fear. Myth 2. Chivalry protected the weak. Knightly tournaments at Henry's court weren't noble sport, but political weapons. The king used them to demonstrate strength, humiliate opponents, and reward allies. Henry himself received serious injury at a tournament in 1536. Many historians believe his psychological deviations began then. Chivalrous nobility turned into sophisticated cruelty. The Earl of Surrey, executed for heraldic ambitions, was an exemplary knight poet, warrior, patron of arts. But this didn't save him from the executioner's axe. Myth 3. Women at court were powerless victims. In reality, women played key roles in court politics, but by special rules. They couldn't hold official positions, but influenced decisions through personal relationships with men. Anne Boleyn effectively managed England's foreign policy in the early years of her marriage to the king. Court ladies created their own intelligence network that often surpassed male structures in effectiveness. They knew all secrets because men underestimated their abilities and spoke about the most secret things in their presence. Myth 4. Common people lived worse than courtiers. Paradoxically, peasants and craftsmen lived safer than aristocrats in many respects. Their life was hard but predictable. They didn't face royal whims, didn't participate in deadly intrigues, didn't risk their heads for careless words. Statistics show that courtiers' average lifespan was lower than urban merchants. Stress, refined food leading to gout and diabetes, infections from poor hygiene in overcrowded palaces, all this shortened noble lives. Mini-stories. Living witnesses of horror. Story 1. Thomas More's Final Days. June 1535. England's former Lord Chancellor sits in a tower cell awaiting execution. Just 3 years ago, he was one of the kingdom's most powerful men. Henry's closest friend, author of Utopia, a book about just society. More refused to swear allegiance to the king as head of the English Church. Not from political ambition or personal enmity by conscience's command. He was ready to acknowledge the king's divorce, agree to the new marriage, but couldn't betray his father's faith. More spent his final weeks in the Tower composing a dialogue of comfort against tribulation, a philosophical treatise on preserving human dignity before death. He wrote with charcoal on cell walls because paper had been taken from him. Daughter Margaret came to visit, begging him to renounce his beliefs for his family's sake. "Father, is your conscience more precious than life?" She wept. "My daughter," More replied, "conscience is life. Without it, I would be a living dead man." On the morning of July 6th, More asked the executioner to wait while he prayed. Then he approached the block, adjusted his beard so it wouldn't fall under the axe. "It has committed no treason," he joked. His last words were, "I die the king's good servant, but God's first." The king forbade burying More with honors. The body was thrown into an unmarked grave, the head displayed on London Bridge as warning to other traitors. But a month later, his daughter bribed guards and stole her father's head. She kept it in a casket until her own death. Story 2. Anne Boleyn's Fall. May 1536. England's queen, the woman for whom the king broke with Rome and overturned the country's religious life, sits in the same Tower cell where Thomas More once awaited execution. A month ago, Anne was at the peak of power. She influenced ministerial appointments, dictated foreign policy, patronized Protestant reformers. But she couldn't bear the king a son, only daughter Elizabeth, and several miscarriages. Henry was already eyeing a new favorite, Jane Seymour, a modest court lady from an ancient noble family. Anne felt the ground slipping from under her feet and desperately tried to regain royal love. The accusations against her were absurd. Adultery with 5 men, including her own brother. There was no evidence, only testimony extracted by torture. But the king needed a pretext for divorce, and he got it. At trial, Anne maintained royal dignity. "I'm ready to die. But I grieve for the innocent people my fate has destroyed," she said, meaning the men accused of relations with her. All 5 were executed before the queen. Before execution, Anne asked to see her daughter, but was refused. 3-year-old Elizabeth never saw her mother one last time. On the scaffold, Anne delivered the required speech, thanking the king for mercy. But bitter irony sounded in her voice. The French executioner severed her head with one blow. The body was hastily wrapped in a coverlet and thrown into an arrow box. They hadn't even prepared a coffin. The next day, the king married Jane Seymour. Psychology of Survival, How the Terror Machine Works. 24 hours in Henry VIII's world have come to an end. You miraculously survived. But the main lesson is just beginning to sink in. Tyranny isn't a political system, but a psychological virus that infects all society, turning normal people into accomplices of nightmare. Modern psychologists have studied the Tudor court phenomenon and discovered frightening patterns. Henry's system worked on the same principles as 20th century totalitarian regimes, just without modern surveillance technology. First principle: destruction of predictability. The human psyche can't withstand constant uncertainty. When people don't know what's allowed and what isn't, they fall into learned helplessness. Henry's courtiers lived in a world where rules changed daily, and punishment could follow actions that were encouraged yesterday. Dr. Stanley Milgram, author of famous experiments on obedience to authority, analyzed Tudor courtiers' behavior and concluded they demonstrated classic signs of moral blindness, inability to see the ethical side of their actions under authority pressure. Second principle: atomization of society. Henry consciously destroyed horizontal connections between people, forcing them to communicate only through royal power. Friends became informants, families became cells of mutual control. When no one can be trusted, the only support remains the tyrant. Venetian diplomat Gasparo Contarini wrote in 1538, "In England, there is no friendship, only temporary alliances from fear." People are afraid to laugh in company because they don't know what others are laughing at. They're afraid to cry because they don't know what others mourn. Third principle: ritualization of submission. Daily, courtiers participated in ceremonies confirming their dependence on the king. Morning appearances, dining etiquette, evening entertainments, everything became acts of worship. A person who bows to a tyrant daily gradually stops resisting internally. Modern research shows ritual behavior changes beliefs stronger than propaganda. Courtiers began with feigned reverence and ended with sincere adoration of the king, or at least convinced themselves of these feelings' sincerity. Fourth principle: measured terror. Henry didn't execute everyone indiscriminately that would be ineffective. He chose victims so each death carried maximum psychological effect. Executing a popular courtier frightened more than mass repressions against unknown people. Thomas Cromwell was executed at the peak of his power. This served as warning to all others. No one is safe from royal anger. Anne Boleyn perished when her position seemed unshakable. A lesson that closeness to power doesn't protect, but makes more vulnerable. Anatomy of degradation: how normal people become monsters. The most terrible lesson of the Tudor court is that no one is born an executioner or informant. These roles are imposed by the system, and people simply adapt to circumstances that seem unchangeable. Take Richard Rich, the man who betrayed Thomas More at trial. In youth, Rich was More's student, admired his scholarship and principles. Together they translated ancient authors, discussed philosophical problems, dreamed of just government. But when More fell into disfavor, Rich faced a choice: perish with his teacher or save himself through betrayal. He chose life and gave false testimony against More. Later, he justified himself by saying he served justice and the crown. But contemporaries saw shame in his eyes that he tried to hide behind feigned confidence. Rich lived a long life, held high positions, but could never forget the day he betrayed his teacher. In old age, he founded a charitable school and bequeathed it his entire fortune, perhaps trying to atone for youthful sin. Psychologists call this moral injury a condition when a person commits acts contradicting his values under circumstantial pressure. Such people either break and go mad or restructure their value system to justify their actions. Henry's courtiers massively experienced such transformations. They began with small compromises, staying silent when innocents were executed, informing on acquaintances to deflect suspicion from themselves, supporting religious reform they didn't believe in. Each compromise made the next easier. A person who lied under oath once more easily commits second perjury. One who informed on an enemy can inform on a friend. Gradually, moral barriers eroded, and yesterday's decent people became instruments of the repressive machine. Dr. Philip Zimbardo, author of the famous Stanford prison experiment, studied Tudor-era documents and concluded Henry's court was a giant psychological laboratory testing limits of human degradation. Ordinary people are capable of monstrous acts if the system creates conditions for it, Zimbardo wrote. The Tudor court shows how quickly civilized society can become hell if moral restraints are removed from power. Resistance mechanisms: those who didn't break. But not all courtiers became the tyrant's puppets. Some managed to preserve human dignity even under total terror. Their stories are lessons about how to resist the system without losing your soul. Thomas More chose death over betraying his beliefs. His strategy was simple: never compromise on principal matters, even if the price is life. Better to lose your head than your soul, he told his daughter before execution. But heroic resistance wasn't available to everyone. Most people aren't ready to die for principles, and the system knew this. More realistic was the passive survival strategy practiced by less noticeable courtiers. They avoided political discussions, didn't express personal opinions on controversial issues, tried to stay in shadows. Not heroic but effective, many survived Henry's reign and served under his successors. The third strategy was moral underground. Some courtiers outwardly submitted to the system but secretly helped repression victims. They passed letters to prisoners, materially supported executed families, preserved forbidden books. Margaret Roper, Thomas More's daughter, formally acknowledged royal supremacy in the church, but secretly visited Catholic priests, hiding from persecution. She couldn't openly oppose the system, but did what she could within possibilities. Analysis of surviving documents shows moral resistance was wider than commonly thought. People found ways to preserve humanity even in inhuman conditions. They created informal mutual aid networks, secretly read forbidden literature, supported each other in difficult moments. Most importantly, they remembered that what was happening was abnormal. Many courtiers wrote diaries or letters recording their real thoughts about the regime. These documents became invaluable testimony about how people preserved inner freedom in outer unfreedom. Modern parallels. When history repeats. Tudor England seems like distant past, but its lessons are frighteningly relevant. In the 21st century, we see authoritarian tendencies reviving in various countries using the same psychological mechanisms as Henry VIII. Personality cult, suppression of criticism, creating atmosphere of universal distrust, using fear as management tool. All this hasn't disappeared into the past, but acquired new forms. Modern technologies make control over people even more effective than in Tudor times. Social networks became new instruments of informing. People themselves tell about their thoughts, meetings, plans, creating detailed pictures of public moods for authorities. Algorithms identify potential dissidents more accurately than any 16th century spies. But most dangerous is that many people voluntarily renounce freedom in exchange for illusion of safety. They're ready to tolerate restrictions if promised protection from external enemies and internal traitors. Henry's courtiers also thought their system was lesser evil compared to civil war chaos or foreign invasion. They convinced themselves the king protected the country from enemies, and repression victims were inevitable price of stability. History shows authoritarianism always justifies itself with noble goals. Tyrants don't say, "I want power for power's sake." They promise order, prosperity, national greatness. But the result is always the same. Society degrades, economy stagnates, culture dies. England under Henry was a mighty power, but this might rested on fear. When the king died, the system began collapsing. Decades were needed to restore normal relations between power and society. Debunking myths. Modern romanticization of tyranny. Modern mass culture dangerously romanticizes Henry VIII's era. Hollywood films and popular series show beautiful fairy tales about gallant knights and fair ladies, silencing the real price of this beauty. Myth 5. Strong hand brings order. Henry indeed suppressed rebellions and uprisings, but at the cost of turning the entire country into prison. Order based on terror is unstable. It holds only on fear of punishment. Once repressions weaken, chaos returns with doubled force. Statistics show that under Henry, crime didn't decrease, but increased. People living in constant fear become more aggressive and cruel. Society without justice breeds injustice at all levels. Myth 6. Repressions only affected elites. Actually, terror penetrated all social layers. Peasants were executed for refusing to pay new taxes, craftsmen for careless words about the king, priests for sermons not matching official line. Pilgrimage of Grace, the Northern England uprising in 1536, was suppressed with monstrous cruelty. Henry promised amnesty to participants, then executed about 200 people, including women and teenagers. Myth 7. Economic prosperity justifies political repressions. England under Henry indeed grew richer, but through robbing monasteries and confiscating private property. The king sold stolen property to courtiers, creating appearance of economic growth. Actually, agricultural productivity declined, craft production stagnated, trade contracted due to political instability. Only those close to power grew rich, others became poorer. Myth 8. Great achievements in art and science. Talented artists and writers indeed worked under Henry, but most worked in an atmosphere of fear and self-censorship. Many works of that era are veiled criticism of the regime or attempts to please the tyrant. Hans Holbein, the great portraitist, was forced to flatter the king, depicting him more handsome and majestic than he actually was. Poets composed laudatory odes while hiding true feelings. Science developed only in areas that interested the king. Practical lessons. How to recognize and prevent tyranny. Studying the Tudor era gives us tools for recognizing authoritarian tendencies in the modern world. Tyranny doesn't come immediately. It develops gradually and can be stopped if you know the warning signs. First signal: personalization of power. When a leader begins identifying himself with the state, when criticism of his politics equals treason, this is the path to tyranny. Henry considered himself England's embodiment, and any disagreement with him became betrayal of homeland. Second signal: destruction of independent institutions. Henry systematically destroyed all structures that could limit his power: church, parliament, courts. He didn't formally abolish them, but turned them into decorations lacking real influence. Third signal: creating cult of fear. When people are forced to fear speaking truth, when honesty becomes dangerous and hypocrisy becomes survival condition, society moves toward tyranny. Fourth signal: using crises to expand power. Every rebellion, every external threat became pretext for new repressions. Emergency measures gradually became life's norm. Fifth signal: fanning mutual distrust. Tyrants always strive to separate people, turn them against each other. When society splits into warring groups, authorities can more easily control each. But Henry's court's main lesson is that resistance is always possible. Even in the harshest conditions, people can preserve human dignity and help others. You don't have to be a hero, it's enough to simply remain human. Conclusions: what we can do today. Henry VIII's court isn't just historical exotica, but warning about how quickly civilized society can slide into barbarism. Tyranny isn't a political system, but psychological epidemic that infects people with fear and turns them into crime accomplices. But we have advantages over Henry's subjects. We know history, understand authoritarianism's mechanisms, have democratic institutions. Most important, don't repeat their mistake. Don't succumb to the illusion that this doesn't concern us. Practical recommendations for everyone. Study history. It teaches recognizing dangerous tendencies early. Support independent media and civil society. They first signal threats to freedom. Don't stay silent when you see injustice. Indifference makes you an accomplice. Remember, tyrants win not by force, but by fear. When people stop being afraid, tyrants' power crumbles. Henry VIII's court history is a lesson about silence's price and resistance's strength. Don't let the past repeat. Defend freedom while it exists. Losing it is easy, returning it almost impossible. Dear viewers, this historical lesson is especially important today when authoritarian tendencies revive in many countries. Share in comments. Do you see parallels between Tudor England and the modern world? What can we ordinary people do to protect democracy and human dignity? Your voices matter. Tyranny wins when good people stay silent. Subscribe to the channel, share this video with friends. Knowledge of history is our protection against repeating its mistakes. See you in next episodes where we'll continue studying past lessons for understanding the present.